This episode of the Techology Show is brought to you by Wesley Seminary at Indiana Wesleyan University. Wesley Seminary offers a 75 credit hour Master of Divinity program available in both English and Spanish, a 36 credit hour Master of Arts in Ministry Leadership or in Children, Youth, and Family Ministry, and a 36 credit hour Master of Practical Theology. For more information, visit Wesley Seminary online at seminary.indwes.edu. It's Tuesday, April 1st, 2014, April Fool's Day, and no joke, we're living in a galaxy world. Hold on here. And here we go. No joke, it's the Techology Show. We will not treat you like the other news sources you'll be visiting today. Everything we say is truth with a capital T. My name is Matthew Teachy.
I'm Heath Mulligan.
Hey, and I'm Tony Casey. Welcome to the Techology Show, weekly podcast featuring technology, theology, and everything in between. This is episode 242.
I was trying to come up with a lie for April Fool's Day.
But you couldn't do it.
Couldn't do it.
You will
See,
notice.
we cannot tell a lie.
You will notice, Heath. I
right.
am wearing my Wisconsin sweatshirt here. We've made it to the Final Four,
And so have the Clemson Tigers, albeit in a different place. But yes, we are in the Final Four as
and
well.
the Tar Heels didn't make it far in the tournament, but they're putting out some great graduates, some high-quality people into the workforce, and so that's what makes me
we'll
happy.
talk about that later.
Tony, I'll just say to you, I speak for every ACC fan
Okay.
when I say we're with you.
Okay.
We don't want to see Kentucky win. We don't want to see Florida win, even though my sister-in-law is a Florida grad.
Right.
And we certainly don't want to see UConn win. Wisconsin graduates more players in a week than those three schools graduate in a decade.
So get this.
So
we filled out a family bracket this year, just inside our family. So only about 8 people participating inside our immediate family. And Ashley, my wife, she decided to systematically fill hers out by going with the team name and how it correlates to elements on the periodic table by their weight, by their mass. So how many atoms are in it?
No.
So whichever school's initials had the greater mass or weight won the thing. She has Connecticut going to the end. Like I never thought this was going to happen.
No
But
way.
She has them all the way to the end, and they're still alive.
How crazy would that be? Oh, hey, Heath, talk about our giveaways, man.
all right, so listen, let me just tell you, we're loaded. So first of all, we're going to be doing a giveaway of this book. We interviewed Dr. Matthew Sleeth last week, his book 24/6 on reinserting the Sabbath back into your life. Great book right there. Hold on.
Type that in your URL bar. And you'll get there.
Techology/giveaway. And then we have not one,
Not one. Mm-mm.
but two autographed copies of the book of today's guest, A Life Observed, spiritual biography of C.S. Lewis by Dr. Devin Brown, University of South Carolina grad. I just want to say that, and we're willing to. I'm happy to have him on the show today.
All right, with that, let's just go ahead and introduce you to Devin Brown. He's a Lilly Scholar and Professor of English at Asbury University, where, among other things, he teaches a class on C.S. Lewis. He is the author of 7 books, including A Life Observed, a spiritual biography of C.S. Lewis. In the summer of 2008, Dr. Brown was invited to serve as the scholar in residence in the Kilns, where for a week he taught a class on Lewis in Lewis's library each day. And get this, guys, even slept in C.S. Lewis's bed each night. He wrote the script for and appeared in the documentary C.S. Lewis, Why He Matters Today, which has interviews with such figures as Eric Metaxas, Tim and Kathy Keller, Chuck Colson, and Michael Flaherty. He is currently working on a new biography of J.R.R. Tolkien, which comes out this fall in advance of the third and final Hobbit film. Devin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, guys. And I should just kind of also point out, just to finish your opening talk, I'm talking to you from Lexington, Kentucky, home of the Wildcats. Great spoilers. So beware.
Is that are you officially going on record, Devin, that you are rooting for the Wildcats?
Like all transplants here, I root for them when they're winning, which this year wasn't always. So,
Right.
So as of the last week, I am a huge Wildcat fan. That may end next weekend.
Well, as a Wisconsin fan, I hope it does end next weekend.
And we're assuming that also means that you're a fan of organized crime and you like.
Well, I'll tell you if you want to really mix it up, I got my PhD from the University of South Carolina, as you mentioned, but I got a master's degree from Gatorville, University of Florida.
Oh,
so,
wow.
talk about conflicted. Holy moly.
Goodness.
So, wow, you got
Basically,
three.
I can find one of my schools that's winning somewhere at any given time.
Well, Devin, we broadcast about 15, 20 minutes from Clemson. I am from Clemson. I bleed orange, so that's why I brought that up.
All right. Listen, let's jump in your book. In the preface of your book, there's something that you say that it grabs my attention right away. You say this, quote, "Anyone who sets out to write a new book about a famous person should do so only because either A, some new source of information has become available, or B, the author takes a new approach." And then you go on to say, "My justification for A Life Observed, a spiritual biography of C.S. Lewis, is the latter." Take some time, Devin, and just expound on that and give us, kind of the evolution of this book as it pertains to your personal decision to write it.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, a very nice but very blue-collar part of town, and went to a very nice but very blue-collar church down there. And I, to help people get an idea, I say you could go for miles and not find anybody who'd ever read a poem. Anyway, my church was very good on that verse, "Thou shalt love the Lord with all thy heart, all thy soul, and all thy mind." They were very good on the first part, a lot of emotion, but not so much on the mind part. And so here I was, this kind of bookish young boy growing up there, blue-collar, south side of Chicago, and I had never heard of Lewis growing up. I mean, I teach a class at Asbury now on Lewis and Tolkien, and of course all my students know about Lewis. Matter of fact, everybody since the Narnia movies knows about Lewis. Yeah. But I didn't grow up knowing him. My older brother goes off to college, and I'm a sophomore in high school, 16. He comes home at Thanksgiving, throws a book on my bed and says, "Here, you should read this." And all like a dutiful younger brother, I, of course, read it. And it was this strange book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? Yeah. And so back then, there's no internet, right? So I didn't know who this was. So I went to this thing that your readers may or may not know about. It's called the library.
Oh.
Yeah, and I asked the librarian, I said, "My brother gave me this book. Are there any other books by this author?" And, lo and behold, there's 6 other ones sitting on the shelf in that same series, The Chronicles of Narnia. And then when you finish that, there's this other kind of writing like Mere Christianity or Problem of Pain. And then there's lots of books. Lewis, so Lewis becomes my favorite author, with Tolkien kind of a very close second. But, I can't, there's no classes on Lewis when I'm going to college. You can't major in Lewis or write a dissertation on him in graduate school. So when I finish, as the ink is drying on my dissertation, I say, okay, good, now I can do what I want. Great, I'm going to sort of read and hopefully try to write about Lewis and Tolkien. And so I've never really turned back since. So here's the deal, and some of your audience may not know this, is that while books by Lewis sell pretty well, quite well, right, and have, for the longest time, here in the 21st century, he's as popular or more popular than he was in the 20th. Books about him, not so much, right? And so you typically, if you want to publish something besides a really narrow university press, we print 1,000 copies, libraries buy 400, specialists buy 100, and we have 500 in some basement somewhere. If you want to publish a book that has a wider range, you have to find something different to say or some wave to ride. So there's been about 6 or 7 pretty good biographies about Lewis. That's a long-winded answer to your question, but and I would call them mostly more or less comprehensive biographies that tell a little bit about everything: who his great-grandfather was, where he lived, things like that. Yeah. And that information is good and useful, but it's already out there. Right. And so, and I'll just say this: at the end of the day, that's not what drew me to Lewis, right? So with those two things in mind, to say, well, I want to try and say something different, take a different line, and I want to follow the line that's interested me most. We come to this idea of joy. Lewis called it joy. And this is one weird thing. And Lewis, a master of words, everyone looks to him as this great writer, a maker of great metaphors. doesn't come up with a great word because, well, we already have a word, joy. Well, he capitalizes it when he writes about it. And what then he describes it. He says there's this longing in each of us, which can never be satisfied in this world. And he says we try all sorts of things. You have a spouse that you love, or family, or a job that you love, or hobbies that you love, or spend time in nature. And they all sort of seem like they might fulfill this longing, but, well, they don't. And at the end of the day, there's this longing for something that can't be satisfied in this world, and there's something about this longing. Most longings leave you feeling kind of empty. This one left him feeling fuller and felt better than any satisfied longing. Well, he grows up as an atheist. Maybe we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
But he calls this thing joy, and he says, now, where should that come from? His autobiography is called Surprised by Joy. And this is that longing joy, capital J joy. And he's surprised by it because what? As a very serious atheist and materialist, and by that word I don't mean someone who wants a big house and 10 cars. Someone who believes that matter is all there is, that atoms and molecules, what we can see, touch, that's all there is. He was surprised, but in fact you could say he was shocked that he would have this longing because he didn't believe in that stuff. And if we're all just atoms and molecules, why should we long for something that, well, can't be satisfied? So he's surprised by it. And so this is this thread that runs throughout his life. And toward the middle of his life, in his 30s, he figures out that this longing was actually for God, for heaven. And so that's what my biography focuses on, mostly that. I don't really tell who his great-grandfather was or where he lived or anything like that. I try to trace that, and I trace it in Lewis's own life, hence the subtitle of the Spiritual Biography of C.S. Lewis, which, by the way, isn't the best subtitle. If someone else could somehow say that in a more catchy way, maybe if we do a second edition, we'll pop it in. But anyway, that kind of tells what it's about, although it sounds drier than I think it is.
Let me break in here. When it comes to his atheism, he had a religious background. You make that clear. How does he kind of jettison that religious background and then get into atheism?
Yeah, and I'll just say this, because my biography focuses on his spiritual life, and by the way, don't think that I'm not going to cover where he went to school and who he meets and what he writes, but the center of it is his spiritual biography. So I hit all the other highlights. You can't not do that. But yeah, I am able to spend more time talking about his childhood faith, which bears a little teasing apart. You had a perfect word. You said he had a religious background. He grew up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and his parents were Protestants. They went to the Church of Ireland, which is under the big umbrella of the Anglican Church. And Lewis was very careful not to criticize other people. He found this religious infighting to be incredibly distasteful. And, I suppose if any of us had grown up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and saw, the troubles, as they called it, between the Catholics and Protestants, people throwing rocks and bombs at each other because you're the different flavor of Christian. Of course you'd find that not to be of the Holy Spirit, but to be the other direction. Right? And so he never got into that. But anyway, he didn't say too much about his religious upbringing, other than to say, to make it clear that he didn't consider himself a Christian as a young boy. He went to church. He said he believed what he was told to believe, but it didn't go very deep. As a young child, having said that, he goes off to boarding school, like all sort of boys of his class did. And he ends up going to a church when he's about 10 or 11 where they really believed what they said there. And when he says that, you kind of wonder if he's saying that maybe in my earlier church they didn't really believe it too much. I don't know. He's careful not to say that. Anyway, he comes to what he calls to be, in his words, an effective believer. And I'll just tell you this, he has the fruits of an effective believer. He begins to pray. He begins to make a list of the kind of young boy he wants to be, and he takes his faith quite seriously then. So his earliest religious experience, not seeming to be genuine, he does seem to have a genuine one later. And in my book, I talk about this. I talk about the lack of what I would call an effective and adult spiritual presence in his life. And I got to tell you, a lot of young people today have that same problem. Somehow, despite all the pastors and parents and teachers around them, there's no one who can help guide them in a true spiritual way, a vital way. Anyway, he lacked guidance, and he went off in a couple different strange paths and eventually jettisoned that childlike faith that he picked up at that boarding school when he went to the church where people really believed it. And with no further nourishment, he lost it and from about age 12 to 30, he was a pretty serious atheist.
Yeah. Now, so as he transitions in his life, one of the things that let me tell you personally where I come with Lewis.
Yeah.
I was one who loved his writings, didn't know anything about his life, and I've read a couple of biographies now just in the last 2 or 3 months. One is yours and the other's McGrath's. And towards the end here, I want to just kind of pick your brain a little bit about McGrath's biography.
Okay.
But I was shocked. I did not know, and I almost feel bad even acknowledging this. I had no idea the role that Tolkien plays in Lewis's life as far as his religious journey is concerned. And one of the things I really want to get to today in this interview is that specific thing. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, in my book I say that the story of Lewis's faith journey is as interesting, as unpredictable, and I would say as inspiring as any of the fictional stories he would later write. It's not all writers have an interesting story of their own life. I would guess most people. I mean, if they made a story of any of our lives, our mom would buy a copy. That might be it. But his life is quite interesting. And so he's a serious atheist. He goes to Oxford, and let's just be honest, even before he's the C.S. Lewis we know, he's really smart. He gets a degree in philosophy and gets a double first in that, and that's the highest degree you can get from Oxford. And then there's no job in philosophy, so he kind of has liked literature and language. So he goes, like all proper students, he goes back and gets another degree because there's no job, and gets one in English. And it's very providential that first he got the degree in philosophy, because without that degree, I don't know that we would have miracles and the problem of pain and those kind of things.
Right.
But had there been a job in philosophy, off he goes, and we would have never had those other kind of works. He switches over to English, and he gets a job in English. And so in 1926, he goes to a meeting of what's called the English School at Oxford. And by the way, translating the states to Oxford and present to past has been an interesting thing. Anytime you study an author in depth, you learn a lot about history and the context of it. Anyway, Oxford's English department was somewhat new. You're thinking, really? Because every school in America has an English department now, and every school in England has one, but it wasn't always the case. There was a time where they said, well, what do we need an English department for? Everybody can read English. Why would you even need a class in it, right? Anyway, it came into existence rather late in terms of Oxford's life, right around the turn of the century, and it was small for a number of years. And even when Lewis came to Magdalen College in 1925, it was small. 1926, he goes to a meeting of the English school, and we don't have all the records, but I read one thing where they thought there might have been 6 faculty in the whole Oxford system that were teaching English. And so Lewis is one, and there's this guy from Pembroke College who's a professor named J.R.R. Tolkien. And by the way, I'll just say this. People say his name umpteen jillion names, even people who knew him. If you get real serious about it, I think you're supposed to say Tolkien, like I'm keen on Tolkien. Having said that, I grew up never hearing it pronounced, so every other time I say it, I'll say Tolkien. Anyway, Professor Tolkien is there, and Lewis meets him, and, Lewis is a serious atheist, and, they become friends, and he kind of thinks that he'll influence these Christian friends that he begins to pick up at Oxford, and to his great surprise, it's they who begin to influence him. Yeah. Lewis has an odd track, in one sense, to faith. He's a philosopher, and he becomes an idealist. And that doesn't mean what we mean today, is that you're high-minded and you're not very practical. Back then, it meant something strange in terms of philosophy, that you believed in this sort of, I don't know what it was, this sort of ideal being who wasn't very personal, but somehow, anyway, even Lewis has trouble explaining it and finally ditches it because it doesn't work for him. Doesn't make any sense. But he came to believe in God first, and that's something I think a lot of non-believers who have a faith journey can come to, that they say, well, eventually I looked at the world around me, and all the evidence pointed to the idea that there must be some kind of God. And so he comes to belief in God first, and here all the time Tolkien is a serious lifelong Christian. He happened to be a Catholic, but he's been an influence on Lewis, as been this other group of Christian friends that he finds himself liking and hanging around and admiring. Anyway, there's this famous walk that lies next to Lewis's college. It's called Addison's Walk. Joseph Addison was a student at Malden, and then he becomes this kind of famous journalist. This is 100 years before Lewis is there. And you can walk in that today. I keep thinking sometime I'm going to go over in September and walk at the same time that Lewis, Tolkien and Hugo Dyson walking. And these guys stayed up late at night, so I'd have to take a nap because they would go out and walk at 11 p.m. Anyway, this talk and walk lasted till about 2 or 3 in the morning. And they're walking on this autumn September night, and it's very still, and all of a sudden, whoosh, this wind comes out of nowhere, rustling the leaves and kind of taking their breath away. And on this night, Tolkien had been talking to him other nights. Let's just get that straight. But on this very night, there was something in Lewis that was receptive.
Yeah.
And Tolkien says, look, and he calls him Jack, because Lewis called himself Jack. He didn't like his name, Clive Staples, and well, who would? He says, listen, Jack. He says, you love these stories
right.
of the dying God, the God who comes to earth when you find them in other mythologies. You find them very moving, very effective, but you don't want it when it's Christianity. He said, particularly you, not necessarily everybody, you need to be thinking of this first as a story, as a myth, and think about what a great story it is, and how moving and how perfect it is, and how it touches your heart. And then think of it as a myth that actually happened. So for Lewis, that was the key. He said, yeah, you're right. I love this story when I read it in other places. Yeah. And so I personally need to think of it as this great story that actually took place. So over the next couple of days, Lewis keeps thinking on this, and it keeps working on him. And I'll just tell you, so Lewis has a track somewhat like other people in coming to faith. He comes to believe in God first. Truly, he comes to see the inadequacies of atheism first. I'll just say that. Yeah. And then comes to believe in God. And then he gradually comes to believe in Christ. And it's a gradual thing. So I know there's a lot of Christians who can say, on October 31st, I gave my life to Christ, and there's this momentary thing. But for Lewis, it was a gradual thing. And to make it further very idiosyncratic and say, God works in mysterious ways, he tells of this famous story. Because he knows people want to know the story. He said, my brother and I were going to Whipsnade Zoo. And, this is back then when gas is expensive and hard to come by. So they take his brother's motorcycle, which has a sidecar. And, the picture of Lewis riding in a sidecar with his older brother driving him down these back roads to the zoo is kind of cool, but also kind of nuts. And all he says is, I can't really tell you exactly how it happened. All I can say is when I left, he'd been thinking about it, but he didn't believe that Jesus was God's son, and when he got there, he did.
Yeah.
So there's how he tells his story, and I think that sometimes people have a very linear movement, and Lewis certainly had some clear steps to becoming to believe in God, but there are also these leaps, and that would be the last one.
Because you are following his spiritual biography, this is one area where I think that this book shines as you just articulate how he comes to faith. As you said, especially in an evangelical world, we want to know the date, the time, nail this down, give it to me in a very clear, concise testimony, and you do a beautiful job of just telling the story of how this gradual thing where he comes to faith. Another surprise about this book, something I did not know, not only is Tolkien very instrumental in Lewis's faith story, but these two men, it was like iron sharpening iron when it came to their literary careers, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. And so that, for some reason, this is the greatest untold story in literary friendships. And I keep waiting for a movie to come out or something that's going to tell this great story. So, so without Tolkien and his influence, Lewis may never have become a Christian. Without Tolkien, there may never have been Chronicles of Narnia. There may never have been Mere Christianity. There may never have been the Screwtape Letters. Without Tolkien's influence. And I got to tell you, this is a great message to Christians today is you have a friend who's not a believer. You first off need to be their best friend in the world and greatest supporter. And second off, you need to keep encouraging them, not hammering them, but encouraging and helping them in their faith journey toward Christ. So here's Tolkien, meets Lewis in 26, and Lewis doesn't become a theist until 1929 and a Christian the year later. And so, that's a long time. And Tolkien's always there. And so without Tolkien, there's no Narnia, there's no Mere Christianity or Screwtape. But without Lewis, there's no Lord of the Rings.
Right. That's incredible to
me. How
me.
does that story not get told? So Tolkien's working on this stuff, and later in life.
Now you're
right,
doing.
So
you're
streaming
going to ask them
anything we say now could make it into the recording on YouTube. So, ready? Here we go.
Gotcha. Okay. I'm
in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's try this again.
All right, Devin. We want to go back to you were just talking about. Tolkien's influence on Lewis's writings, take a second to talk about how Lewis influences Tolkien.
Yeah, so if we can say, and I think we can, that without Tolkien, there would have been no Chronicles of Narnia, no Mere Christianity, no Screwtape Letters, because he was essential in Lewis's faith journey for him becoming a Christian. We can also say that without Lewis, there would have been no Lord of the Rings. This is something that took Tolkien about 12 years to write. I think he quit 2 or 3 times, one time for a whole year.
Yeah.
And each time there's Lewis saying, hey, Tollers, that's what he called him, the British equivalent of, don't leave me hanging, right? Merry and Pippin just got dragged off by orcs. Sam and Frodo are just going over the river. What happens next? So in a letter late in life, Tolkien writes of the unpayable debt that he owes Lewis for his sheer encouragement. He says, For long he was my only audience. Yeah. Now, I just got to stop there and just say, millions of people today have read The Lord of the Rings, all over the world, millions and millions. But for many years, it's just Lewis there reading it, saying, this is great, this is going to be good, keep going, keep going, keep going throughout the years. And I don't know if there's anybody out there who spent 12 years working on a book. But, that's long. We don't do that these days. If you don't finish a book in a couple years, well, you're done. Anyway, but with Lewis there urging Tolkien on, he finally brings the Rings to completion, and he's quick to say it in many places. I would not have done this without Lewis. So it's a story of a great literary friendship.
Yeah.
Before we move on to our next question, we have a great word from our sponsor today, Wesley Seminary at Indiana Wesleyan University.
The MDiv program at Wesley Seminary is unique in the respect that we have spiritual formation going on throughout your entire seminary career. I've been to other seminaries, I've been a seminarian at points, and usually there's the token course in spiritual formation. But here, spiritual formation is done every regular semester. When you're taking a full load, you're also taking spiritual formation because it's such a part of who you are as a minister. It's not an auxiliary part, it's not a nod at God, it's not an add-on. It's part and parcel of who you are, and you minister from the base of who you are as a person of God. And so that's always kept at the forefront here. And so in the spiritual formation program, which is a parallel track that goes on with every course that you take during a regular semester, we constantly look at different aspects of what it means to be a person of God and a person of God in ministry. Because adding that ministry dimension adds a whole different level of understanding about what it means to be connected to God. So spiritual formation in seminary is one of the ways that we keep ministers and Christian leaders connected to God as they are learning, so that the learning is always done mindful of how it affects the people of God, how it affects one's walk with God, how it empowers you to do ministry for God. God is always at the center of it. So when we are teaching and mentoring in spiritual formation, those are the things that we keep at the forefront.
Hey, Devin, before we move on, continue talking about the book, we do have a question from the chat room, and it is, what did you think of the Shadowlands movie with Anthony Hopkins, which was my first introduction to C.S. Lewis? I had no idea who he was until I saw that movie.
Yeah, and I'll just say this. That's a question that comes up a lot among Lewis people. I'll give you the 1-minute answer. Obviously, that could be its own show if we wanted. But this movie's, it was out a long time ago. So some people may not have seen it or may have seen it on DVD. But for a lot of people back then, it was compared to, kind of like the Narnia movies. It's what made Lewis a household name, a name that lots of people had never heard of before suddenly heard of.
Yeah.
So yeah, Anthony Hopkins plays Lewis there at Oxford, and in some ways he does a good job. His deep love for Joy Gresham, whom he meets late in life, his deep grief when she dies, and his coming to terms with that grief, I think Anthony Hopkins did a great job on. And those I would call sort of the earthly truths about Lewis. He plays him as a man who was kind of shut up and tight and only came alive when he met Joy Gresham, and that's not accurate at all. It's a little one-dimensional. He was a man who was full of laughter and who knew great joy and great sorrow long before Joy Gresham showed up. So he wasn't this isolated Oxford don that she somehow breaks into the world. That said, they came to know a kind of love he had not known before. The other place where the movie doesn't get it, because it can't get it, because it's not a faith-based movie at all, is that Lewis grieved like all people. You know, when St. Paul says, you know, he doesn't say we don't grieve, but he says we don't grieve like people who have no hope.
Yeah.
And at the end, Lewis had lots of questions and doubts. Why did she have to die? And he worked through all those questions. And in the end, if you look at his book, A Grief Observed, he comes to have a peace that passes understanding,
right.
the kind that St. Paul talks about. And, of course, the movie can't communicate that. There is some sort of reconciliation at the end, but nothing like what you find at the end of A Grief Observed, which I talk about in my book, by the way. So,
you know, that movie for me kind of, like I said, was my introduction to C.S. Lewis. Give us some examples of how we see some of Lewis's his own spiritual journey that you talk about in your book. How is that reflected in his writings?
Yeah, so when I started working on tracing Lewis's spiritual biography, we have his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. But if you look at the subtitle, The Story of My Early Life, he traces his life from when he's a little boy all the way up to his conversion when he's in his 30s. And then that's where it ends, right? And so you have to turn to other things to trace that. And he writes a lot of letters, of course, so that's a great place to look for his spiritual growth. But I think it's fair, and I'll tell you why, to look for Lewis's own faith journey in the books he writes. He writes Screwtape Letters about a decade after he becomes a Christian, and it's his breakout book, and that's what puts him on the cover of Time magazine. And at some point there's a second edition, which gets a preface. And in the preface, he says, now I should tell you, a lot of people keep asking me, what have I read? Lots of books on theology so that I can understand how temptation works. He says, I got something a lot better than that to know how temptation works, my own heart. And he suggests that it's his own faith experiences that lead him to write about this story of this patient, Wormwood's patient, there in Screwtape Letters. So Lewis there is telling us that he's looking at his own heart when he writes his fiction. So, in that book, for example, Screwtape Letters, we have an adult convert who becomes a Christian. Okay, there's Lewis. We have an adult convert who is influenced by new friends, both the good kind and the bad kind, just like Lewis at Oxford. His very anti-Christian colleagues and his very strong believing we have a convert who has conflicts with an unbelieving mother figure in his life. Lewis's stepmother gave him a lot of grief about his new faith. I don't know how well people know Screwtape, but the convert has these periods of ups and downs. He calls them undulations, and this idea where he needs to rely on his reason more than just his feelings. Well, Lewis writes about that all the time. And this convert falls away from the faith or his initial love, and he comes back through two pleasures, which were two of Lewis's pleasures, a lovely walk and a good cup of tea. Yeah. And Lewis talks about how the pleasures have us look up the sunbeam to the sun. So you're out there and the sun's beautiful and you look up at the sun. And he basically says God speaks to us in our pleasures. And we think not only are we thankful for them, but what kind of a God would have given us these lovely things? And then finally he talks about this patient's church shopping. Of course, Lewis could have gone down the hill. He lived in Headington, up about 2 miles outside Oxford. He could have gone down the hill and gone to church at Christ Church Cathedral there at Oxford and heard the Bishop of Oxford speak and had this really great boys' choir every week. But instead, he went to his local church parish where the preaching wasn't as good and the music certainly wasn't as good and the people were not as well educated as Lewis. And so all those things come right out of Lewis's own life. While we're at it, it's not like Lewis didn't draw on it for the Chronicles of Narnia either. And I'll just give 2 quick examples. Eustace Clarence Scrubb, Voyage of the Dawn Treader begins. There once was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. Well, you don't have to be an English teacher to kind of say, well, Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. Lewis didn't like his own name, Clive Staples Lewis, right? And if you look at the initials, Eustace Clarence Scrubb, his last 2 initials, second and third initials are CS, and Lewis's first 2 initials are CS. Yeah. And the word Eustace is not too different from Lewis. I think it's a hint that Lewis was modeling this, as Edmund calls him, this record stinker after his own life. This smart kid who was guilty of the sin of great pride. And of course, Lewis has that chapter in Mere Christianity because that was his great sin, and that's how he knew a lot. He could write well about the great sin of pride because, well, that's one that he suffered from. And then, of course, when you get to the last battle, and they're coming home, and they go, man, this was the place I was meant for. I've always been longing for this place in my life, says Jewel the Unicorn as they're running around the new Narnia. Well, that's Lewis's own life story too. This search for joy and where it ends up. So yeah, he's not writing someone else's story when we get to the Chronicles of Narnia or Screwtape Letters or any of those books. He's putting his own story and the story he knows into fiction.
Yeah, after reading your book, I feel like the silver chair has taken on a whole different meaning for me, because especially with Lewis's concept of joy, and this idea of some of our listeners, viewers may be familiar with Plato and his cave analogy, that we see forms, but they're only reflections of the real thing. And oh man, that just came alive for me after I read your book. That okay, I see what Lewis is doing here. And just your book is chock full of these things where there are connections that are made. How is it that Americans begin to come in contact with Lewis? What's kind of the history there?
Yeah, and I'll just say this. A lot of people used to know Lewis through Mere Christianity and Screwtape, right? Those were his first big hits. Matter of fact, he has these BBC talks during World War II that eventually become Mere Christianity. But so in the 40s, he becomes famous. All over the world. He's on the cover of Time magazine. And he writes this famous letter as things begin to cool down for him, as they always do in literary things. He says, I'm going to be one of these guys who was kind of famous in his 40s and then dies unknown. And he writes this just before Chronicles of Narnia begin to take off, which is, in answer to your question, I think how people come to know him now. And I'll just say, there's a lot of people who come to know Lewis now through the Narnia films, just because they reach a broad audience. And that's, as much, whatever you feel about them, and that could be another whole show, right? I mean, I'll just give you the conventional wisdom is the first one seemed to be more faithful to the book and better, and with each successive one, to some degree or not, depending on your opinion, they became less faithful and less great. So,
Can we talk about this?
Yes,
for just a second,
just
all right?
park here.
Tony and I love this discussion. So, Voyage of the Dawn Treader ends up telling the exact opposite story of what I feel like that book is intended to tell. It's like the ending song. They wrote a song for the film, and the song ends with this thing, and the lyrics of the song are follow your dreams and whatever you wish for you're gonna get, and all this kind of stuff. And it's the story's just not about that at all. It's so crazy.
Yeah. I think it's best to just try and read the credits or head out so you don't have to avoid the crowd. I do like the last line. I mean, they did get the last line right. Lucy is told that she's not coming back by the lion on the beach there, and she says, well, what about you? It's not Narnia, it's you. And he says, well, I'm in your world too, and that's why you've been brought. So that line is there. And I also get that sometimes when they ask people to write songs, those songs don't come out like they wanted or whatever, and they have to use them anyway because they spent all this money. Anyway, you're right to say the song leads us off in another direction. So it's best to ignore that and focus on those final lines.
Devin, you have described my journey with these first three. The way you described it, I feel that is my opinion. And so if I can, as just a Lewis fan, if I could just speak into this, I have said to Matthew, I want them to get like about 5 Lewis scholars in one room. Because I felt like on the third one that there was a little bit of alienation from the base. And I'm telling you that the base will carry these movies. The base will carry these movies. There are 2-3 generations that have grown up with these now.
Yep. Yeah. No, look, this could be another whole topic. I'll give you my 1-minute version, and that's this. We filmed Michael Flaherty, the producer at Walden, who was President Walden, who was making these films, and I talked to him a number of times about some of the conflicting pressures from a variety of filmmakers.
Sure.
And then Douglas Gresham has come to become a really nice friend of mine since he and I began let's say corresponding, and that's another little question.
Explain to our listeners who he is.
He writes the foreword, and it says it takes a very, I don't know if he says bold man or brave man to write a book about my stepfather and ask me for some suggestions. So anyway, I've gotten to know him and talked to him a bit about the Narnia films. And just in brief, in case people haven't heard, he's not disagreeing with us at all on those. He's sort of the Narnia police. He's there to make sure they get made and made in the right way. And I think he felt like they were going in a direction that was not good. And so he unplugged them from Walden. And then legally he's got to wait 7 years before they get restarted. And if you've read any of the internet stuff, they're officially restarted with Silver Chair. And it has a tentative date of December 2017. to come out and be back in a more proper direction, a corrective to what came before. So
very good.
So people out there, don't get mad. Hold on, there's more coming. So
right.
And so my question is, what you may have said it, and I may have just not heard you, but did you say what company is going to be doing the movies now?
Yeah, those things all get put together, and I think part of the whole deal, I'm not an expert on some of the ins and outs, but I think part of the whole deal is that the C.S. Lewis people, Douglas Gresham, are going to have more creative control at the end of the day. They're going to restructure this so that at the end of the day, they were just one voice in what happened. And I kind of understand a little of Hollywood. In other ways, I don't.
Yeah.
But I think if you hire a great director, and you want a great director, well, that great director is not going to say, well, at the end of the day, if you have some idea that I hate, I have to go with it. So if you want a great director, you have to give them some creative control, which means you lose some. But you do that because that's how great directors work, and so there's a fair bit of give and take. Anyway, I think that everybody agrees with you. Don't think you're what's going on here? Why am I the only? They agree with it. That's why that was unplugged, and that's
good.
Wow.
How it's going to be replugged. So that's good news.
Let me ask another question about this. This is a theory that a friend of mine, actually your son-in-law, Jamin, Tony, and myself, we bounced this around. So we were both children who grew up having access to, on VHS tapes, what the BBC did. With Narnia, and we loved them.
Workfish things,
we loved them as children. I mean, you look back at I look back at them as an adult, and to see a full-sized human dressed in a beaver costume, it is a little weird now to look at this stage of life. But as a child, I loved those things, and they seem to be very, very faithful to the source material. And we've wondered, we've bounced this idea around in our minds, saying, "My goodness, as far as the production that the BBC's been able to do, maybe they're the people." Like you watch Doctor Who is theirs now. Man, they could throw some serious money and do some cool stuff now that you couldn't do in the 80s. I would love to see them get a hold of that again.
Is the BBC also going to? Here's what happens when you make a movie. This is my own 2 cents. You kind of say, well, I have to make something that people are going to really like and a lot of people really like. And basically what you fall back on is, well, I would find this heavy-handed, and this is about the level I'd like. So if you have a bunch of non-believers making a movie, they're going to find that last line about this is the reason you've come to Narnia, to be a little heavy-handed. And that line was almost not in the movie. They had to kind of fight to say, look, we need this line. And the other people said, but don't you think it's kind of heavy-handed, la, la, la. You're right to say that the base would carry it. I happen to think if they make a really faithful one, they'll have more, not fewer people coming to see it. But I get that this is a risk, and if you have someone who finds that stuff a bit distasteful, they're thinking, aren't we going to turn off a lot of people? And you want to go, well, I'll tell you the other faithful one before we go into it is the Focus on the Family Radio Theater. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. But Paul McCusker adapted that.
Oh, my goodness.
It's eminently faithful.
And
I mean, there seems to be two goals. One is I'm going to keep Lewis's original unless I absolutely have to modify it. And then this other sort of school of thought is I'm going to modify Lewis's original unless I absolutely have to keep it.
Yeah. No, it's good analogy. Great breakdown.
Let's speak for those recordings. Oh, yeah, we're still on here. Just had a boo-boo again on our end, but we're still with you. So in those audio recordings, fantastic. Have you ever listened to those, Tony?
I have not.
They're audio dramas. Yeah. You'd love them. I promise you, because you love old radio to begin with.
Right.
You would love them.
Yeah,
Tony.
I love old radio shows. All right.
Yeah, and you can get them now on CD. So they're out there, and they're
get them on Audible.
They're very competitively priced because they're still trying to sell them years after they made them. They're still excellent.
Yeah.
So you just kind of shared an answer to this, but with movies kind of rebooting in 2017. But why do you think that C.S. Lewis has had such an enduring legacy, and will we still be talking about him generations from now?
Yeah, part of it depends on what kind of a culture we become. I have a friend at school at Asbury who talks about the coming new Dark Ages. During the Dark Ages, people were illiterate and didn't read. And the question is are we headed in that way again? Not that they don't know how to read, but they don't read. There's this odd survey of how many Americans had read one whole book in the last year, and I don't remember the number. Maybe I've suppressed it because it's a ridiculously low number. So if people are continuing to read anything, well, they'll continue to read Lewis. As people become less interested in long books, then his B list may fade a bit. I don't know what sales were of Problem of Pain and Miracles and things like that, Great Divorce, at their peak. But certainly if you look at their numbers in England and Europe, they're off that peak. His A list, Screwtape, Mere Christianity, and the Chronicles of Narnia are going to be around for a long time.
I agree.
think.
Yeah.
And I guess if you look at his legacy, in the documentary you guys mentioned, Why C.S. Lewis Matters Today, I tried this thing that you can never do, is sum up what is Lewis's legacy in a sentence. And basically I said, first he reclaims Christian reason. In other words, reason belonged to Christianity for the longest time, and then it gave it up. It gave it up to science, and it became the religion of emotions. And Lewis takes it back. He says, no, that's ours. God made reason, and that's ours, and it has a vital place in our life. And then the second thing I think he does is he rediscovers Christian imagination, this idea of story. I mean, it's integral in communicating, for lack of a better word, heavenly truths or communicating inexpressible truths. That's what Jesus did, right? They said, tell us about God's love. Or he didn't write some sort of philosophical or theological treatise. He said, well, God's love. How can I tell you about that? Well, there once was a man who had two sons, and the youngest said to his father, give me my share of the inheritance. Yeah. And we have the story of the prodigal son. So Lewis rediscovers Christian imagination. Somehow it had been lost, and he finds it again. And then the last huge contribution of Lewis, and of course, again, this is from my own point of view, that you could pick three others, is to restore a Christian view of humanity. Lewis goes to a very secular school in the 20th century where they basically say man is nothing. He's an advanced animal, and all animals are the result of random act, meaningless, purposeless chance.
Yeah.
There's no soul. He goes to World War I. Corpses and pieces of corpses all around him in no man's land. And everything, his academics, his own personal life shouts that man is nothing. The value of man is nothing. And, of course, we have capitalism ramping up into its incredible world force where people are consumers to be used up, the Willy Loman that you eat the orange and throw away the peel. Yeah. And he comes away and says, nope, you're all wrong. All that experience is wrong. All those thinkers are wrong. All of marketing is wrong. There's something radically valueful, worthwhile about each human soul.
Yeah.
And then he has that line in The Weight of Glory. He says, you've never met him, an ordinary person. There are no mere mortals. So to reclaim reason, rediscover Christian imagination, and to restore that Christian vision of humanity. I think we're always going to need those things, and that's his lasting contribution in the 20th century. He's been dead 50 years, and now 5 decades later in the 21st century just as well.
Yeah, that quote out of The Weight of Glory, one of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes of all time. Real quick here, I referenced McGrath's biography on Lewis. I got to tell you, I've only read 2 biographies. One is yours, the other is McGrath's. And these 2 books couldn't be any more different. And with McGrath, I feel like there was a disappointment for me because I felt like that McGrath takes an angle where he wants to give me all of the negative things that he can drum up in Lewis's life. Now, that's not to say I didn't enjoy the biography. I did, and I learned a lot about Lewis through it. Again, as a biographer of Lewis, I don't want to get you in trouble here, but I am curious, your own slant on McGrath's biography and some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so I'll just say this. Alistair McGrath is huge. I am small. He's a world-famous scholar. I'm a, famous in Wilmore on my side of the street scholar. And I don't know that one is right or wrong. I guess it depends on what you're looking for. You started out by saying you had sort of a personal. It wasn't what you were looking for. You didn't find that it really captured, the real meat of Lewis's story. And I read it, of course. And he's a very good writer. He's very bright. As bright as all 3 of us put together easily. But I'll also say this: he works at a research institution, a premier institution, and they're awfully cautious about being objective and not being subjective. So he's a big Lewis fan, so he can't seem like a big Lewis fan in his book, which I get that point of view as an academic. Of course, I think it's nuts. I'm a huge Lewis fan, and you know it in every sentence I write.
Yeah.
And I don't make and I say, look, I am a Lewis fan, and so here's what I'm going to tell you about. Here's why he excites me, not here's why he disappoints me. Anyway. McGrath, who is a Lewis fan, has to take the stance of not being a Lewis fan, and lest he be accused of bias or hero worship or hagiography, he has to, in my opinion, he has to not just tell you all the negative facts, but actually speculate on all the possible negative facts.
Yeah.
In a way that you would never do so about not just a friend, but a colleague. So there's an issue about Lewis's relationship with Mrs. Moore,
Right.
about which there's very little to say. And not only does he say a lot, but he says it pretty definitively,
Yep.
as though it's fact. And you think, really, that you wouldn't do that to a colleague you didn't even like. You wouldn't speculate in the way he does. So I found it not my cup of tea, as the British would say. So that was nice he wrote, his came out before I did, and I got an advance copy. But it was nice, as I was writing mine, to know that I didn't have to work to not go down those same paths as he did, because I was on a whole different tack. So I guess the nice thing to say is there's two different kinds of biographies out there,
Yeah.
his and mine, and people who prefer his may not prefer mine, and people who prefer mine may not prefer his, and there may be people who like them both. I'll just say that his sold a lot more than mine selling, so people who like mine should, go to Amazon as soon as they possibly can and order all their Christmas presents today. So.
Yeah, well, the Mrs. Moore thing was disappointing to me in that he really implies some strong things, but that's what he does. And at the end, as a reader, you're almost left hanging about that, but in a negative way, that you have thoughts about Lewis that you've never had up to that point. But then again, he just leaves you hanging, and then he moves on. So that was, again, I loved the biography, not trashing the biography. I'm just saying that having read these two, there's a totally different feel. Well, Devin, we're up against the clock. Thank you so much for the time you've taken to talk to us. We are going to give these two autographed copies away. We appreciate the donation of those. And just Lord bless you, especially as you're writing this biography of Tolkien.
Well, thanks so much, guys. It's been great talking to you.
All right.
All right, have a
Blessings
good
on you. Bye-bye.
I think they need somebody like that to make the movies. Because here's the thing, and I don't want to get into this, and I don't want to go. It's kind of like the deal with the Noah movie. And I'm not trying to critique the Noah movie. But you have a guy directing the Noah movie that doesn't even believe that actually happened.
Yeah,
so that's what comes through in your movie.
Well, TJ and I, we've talked this just together. We've talked it to death, and that is, I keep saying, get 5 or 6 Lewis scholars in a room, and they should be the ones that are informing you about the movie.
I thought you were going to say get 5 or 6 Lewis scholars in a room with a typewriter, and they might come out with Screw Tape Letters Part 2.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Get 5 scholars in a room and let Matthew and I join that.
So I'm curious. We talk about biographies. There's one other big biography of C.S. Lewis called Jack: A Life of C.S. Lewis by George Sayer. I wonder that was from back in the mid 90s, I believe. Well, no, sorry, mid 2005.
McGrath and Brown both reference Sayers' biography,
Okay.
and each of them talk about what they think they have to uniquely add. I haven't read Sayer. If you want like this comprehensive Lewis life, with all these details, well, McGrath is going to give you that. But I think for a lot of our listeners and viewers, if you want to follow Lewis's spiritual journey, Brown's book is absolutely the way to go.
Right.
And I feel like that I understand his writings. I understand the Chronicles of Narnia better after reading Brown's biography. And like I said, the Silver Chair, totally different now. The way I view that, the way I understand it from the philosophical level that Lewis is coming from. So
That Puddleglum is the hero.
Puddle, not only is he the hero, but he understands that all these people underground only have a reflection of the true reality. They think that this is real life, that this is all there is. And he's saying, no. I've seen the other side. I know what reality is.
And you've come to the resolution that Tom Baker's Puddleglum was the definitive Puddleglum. Yes. Yes. Yes.
One of my favorite moments with our kids is that I read to them the Chronicles of Narnia, Dana and Stephen at one time, and then Nicole at another. And when they saw the BBC thing, Stephen's reaction to Puddleglum, when he first heard him talk, Stephen said, Oh, Dad, that doesn't sound anything like Puddle Glum.
Which made you feel really good.
Oh,
didn't you?
yeah,
You're like,
yeah.
oh,
Yeah, because I would try to give each character a voice.
So give us Tony a little Puddle Glum. Give us a little Puddle Glum.
No,
Tony,
it was Eeyore. If you've heard Eeyore on Winnie the Pooh, I just kind of used Eeyore.
So I can't. Come on. I'm gonna look up Tom Baker.
No.
Puddle Glum. Hold on here.
Yeah. So if Igor was reading, Puddle Glum was reading something, it'd be more like, well, I'm not even going to try. I'm not ready for it.
Tony.
No, I'm not ready for it.
Do it.
No,
all right. Well,
no.
here's Tom Baker.
It was just interesting.
No sun. There is no sun. There never was a sun. There never was a sun.
Sorry, you can't see this, guys.
Daslan. What a pretty name.
All right.
Forget
Come on,
all
Tom.
these
I don't hear him.
childish. Is to be here with me.
There is one thing to say. Suppose
Say hello to my
Suppose we have only dreamed and made up these things.
It's Tom Baker. He's
All
the
right.
Like Pierce Brosnan.
Say hello to my little friend.
So here's the thing. Don't forget, we've got not one, not two,
but three
Yeah.
giveaways.
My
and-
apologies for not having the 24/6. We got talking about some stuff after the show. It totally slipped my mind, and it's up there now.
Yes,
Go
so
enter.
thetechnologyshow.com/giveaway or the other shortened link.
And how are we doing this, TJ? Are these two separate giveaways?
Yeah, so there's two
Okay.
separate giveaways. There's one for Matthew Sleeth's book. There's
Yeah.
one for Devin Brown's book, and then we'll pick two winners out of whoever
Yeah.
enters the Devin Brown
So you
entry.
could win both out there.
There's a potential for that.
potential to win both. 7 sheets. You are eligible to win.
Obviously, we have no download of the week for you. Neither do we have They Said It, because our time's about gone. Big thanks to Devin Brown for spending the whole
absolutely.
hour with us. Could have easily that's an interview that could have gone on a couple hours.
It's a topic. It's got so many subtopics, and he's a great talker and loves to talk about it. I mean,
he's passionate
yeah,
about it.
yeah. So I mean, more power to him and to us.
And one of the things I love about doing this show is to take a book like that some of our viewers and listeners don't know about, and to bring it to you and to say to you, man, oh man, if you want to just learn something about Lewis that's going to help you, and if you're a Lewis fan but you've never read a biography that's going to help you understand his writings better, this is the choice. Alrighty, I think we're out of time here.
Yeah, I don't know. We're so off schedule. I don't know what's happening.
We are.
Anyways, and I don't have a camera, so it's pretty much because of all these crashes. Apologies, by the way. Our room camera is gone today, so Tony, that's why you're bearing the lion's share of the load.
It's
so
me.
smile.
I'm the face of the technology.
Smile and look happy, man.
As always, if you want to send us an email, we encourage you to do that. You can email us at thetechnologyshow@gmail.com, or better yet, you can give us a call at 3049-TEOLOGY. Just leave us a voicemail. We may even play your comments on the air. As always, thanks for joining us. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Adios.
See, no room camera, can't change. That's all I got.
It's
That's all I
just
got
us.
here, guys.
Wisconsin Badgers.
I got this too, if I want that. But this is all I got.
Go Badgers. Go